I didn't grow up in a peaceful home. My childhood was marked by chaos, shouting, and moments I wish I could erase. My father was often physically aggressive toward my mother, and as a kid I had no idea how to process what I was seeing. There were nights I hid in my room, heart racing, hoping the noise would stop. I felt small, powerless, and invisible. But in the middle of all that pain, I found something that gave me a sense of control. Art. Drawing became my escape. While my home felt unsafe, the page felt like a place where nothing could hurt me. I poured my emotions into sketches, colors, and shapes. When I drew, I wasn't the scared kid in a broken house. I was someone creating something beautiful. Art didn't fix my family, but it saved my sanity. It gave me hope when I didn't have many reasons to feel hopeful. As I grew older, that love for art stayed with me. I carried it through school, college, and into adulthood. By the time I was 27, I had a clear vision. I wanted to use art to help kids who were growing up in difficult circumstances, just like I had. I knew what it felt like to need a safe space, a kind adult, and a creative outlet. So I decided to build something I wished had existed for me. I opened a small community art center focused on children from low-income families. My goal wasn't just to teach them how to draw or paint. It was to give them a place where they felt seen, valued, and safe. I decorated the classroom with bright colors, positive messages, and student artwork. I made sure there were snacks, drinks, and sandwiches so no child would feel hungry while trying to learn. Every class was completely free because I never wanted money to be a barrier to creativity. First, the center thrived. I had full classes, sometimes 15 or even 20 kids at a time. Their laughter filled the room. They shared their stories through art, and I watched their confidence grow. Some kids who barely spoke when they arrived began raising their hands, helping others, and proudly showing their work. It felt like I was finally living my purpose. To keep the center running, I relied on donations and local council funding. I didn't take a salary. I lived modestly, believing that as long as the kids had a place to go, I had everything I needed. For years it worked. The bills were paid, the lights stayed on, and the kids kept coming. But slowly, things began to change. Attendance dropped. Families moved away. New after-school programs opened. The room that once buzzed with energy began to feel quieter. Instead of 20 kids, I had 10, then 8, then 5. I tried everything, new projects, community events, outreach, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, the council reviewed the program and decided it was no longer viable. Funding was cut. I remember sitting alone in the classroom after that meeting, staring at the empty chairs, wondering how something that once felt so alive could be taken away so easily. I had poured my heart, time, and soul into that place. It wasn't just a project, it was my identity. Without funding, the center closed. And without the center, I had nothing. I had never worked a traditional job. I had always survived on grants, donations, and community support. When that disappeared, so did my income. I fell behind on rent. Bills piled up. I had no savings to fall back on. Within months, I went from helping others to barely surviving myself. By the time I was 31, I was homeless. I still remember sitting on the curb with my belongings in a few bags, staring at the street, trying to understand how my life had unraveled so quickly. I had always been the one offering help, not the one needing it. Now I didn't even know where to start. Felt ashamed, overwhelmed, like I had failed everyone, especially myself. And just when I thought I had reached the lowest point, life had more lessons waiting. But homelessness was only the beginning, and what happened next would completely change my life in ways I never expected. Sitting on that curb, surrounded by everything I still owned, I felt frozen. My mind raced with questions that had no answers. How did I go from running a community center to having nowhere to sleep? How did a life built on helping others collapse so completely? I felt embarrassed, defeated, and deeply alone. For a long time, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to burden my friends with my problems. I told myself I would figure it out on my own, that this was just a temporary setback. But as days passed, reality became impossible to ignore. I had no income, no home, no clear plan. Eventually, I reached out to one person, Sarah, a close friend who had always supported my work. She knew how much the art center meant to me and how devastated I had been when it closed. When I told her what had happened, she didn't hesitate. She offered her couch immediately. For a few weeks I stayed with Sarah. She was kind, patient, and encouraging. She kept telling me that things would get better, that this was just a rough chapter, not the end of my story. I wanted to believe her, but every day felt heavier than the last. I applied for job after job, but rejection emails became routine. Some places never even responded. My savings were gone. My confidence was fading. And despite Sarah's kindness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on her life. I didn't want to overstay my welcome. I didn't want to become a burden. So, even though she told me I could stay as long as I needed, I decided it was time to leave. With nowhere else to go, I moved into my car. At first, I told myself it wasn't that bad. It was just a short-term solution. I would find a job soon, save some money, and get back on my feet. I tried to stay positive. I found safe places to park at night. I learned where public restrooms were located. I figured out how to stretch a few dollars as far as possible. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And the weight of my situation began to crush me. Sleeping in a car is not just uncomfortable. It's humiliating. It's waking up stiff and cold. It's brushing your teeth in gas station bathrooms. It's pretending everything is fine when people ask how you're doing. It's feeling invisible in a world that keeps moving, no matter how much you're struggling to survive. I spent my days filling out applications, attending interviews, and hoping for any opportunity. But every rejection chipped away at what little confidence I had left. Some nights, I lay in the back seat, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was how my life was going to be from now on. One particularly cold night, as I lay shivering under thin blankets, I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally. I needed something, anything, to break the cycle of despair. That's when I remembered the mountains just outside the city. I used to take the kids from the art center on nature walks, teaching them about plants, animals, and the importance of slowing down. Nature had always brought me peace. And in that moment, desperate for relief, I decided I would drive to the mountains the next morning and spend the day hiking. It wasn't a solution to my problems, but it felt like a lifeline. The next morning, I packed what little I had and drove toward the mountains. As the city faded behind me and trees filled the landscape, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The air felt cleaner. My chest felt lighter. For the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving, I was breathing. I parked at the trailhead and began walking. With every step, the tension in my body slowly melted away. The sounds of the forest replaced the noise of traffic and anxiety. Birds, wind through the trees, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. It all felt grounding. I walked for hours. As the sun began to set, I found a small clearing near a river. The water glowed under the fading light, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt peace. Real peace. Not the forced optimism I had been clinging to, but a quiet, steady calm. I made a decision right there. I would stay. That night in the forest changed everything, and what I discovered there reshaped my understanding of survival, purpose, and hope. That small clearing by the river became my temporary home. I didn't have much, just a few supplies from my car, some blankets, and a backpack, but somehow it felt like enough. For the first time in months, I wasn't surrounded by concrete, noise, and constant reminders of everything I had lost. I was surrounded by trees, water, and silence. The days that followed were some of the most peaceful I had experienced in years. I spent my time fishing in the river, gathering wild berries, and exploring the surrounding woods. My schedule was no longer dictated by job applications, rejection emails, or deadlines. It was guided by sunrise and sunset. I woke up with the sun, cooked simple meals over a small fire, and fell asleep to the sound of water flowing nearby. There was something deeply healing about that simplicity. Without distractions, I was forced to face my thoughts, but instead of spiraling, I found clarity. I reflected on my childhood, my art center, the choices I had made, and the mistakes I had carried for years. I realized how much of my identity had been tied to helping others, and how lost I felt when that was taken away. But I also realized something important. Losing everything hadn't taken away my ability to start again. Out there in the wilderness, stripped of comfort and security, I discovered that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I had survived abuse, heartbreak, failure, and homelessness, and I was still standing, still breathing, still capable of hope. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a failure. Felt like a survivor. But as peaceful as the forest was, I knew it wasn't a permanent solution. Winter was approaching. The temperatures were dropping. Soon, the mountains would be covered in snow, and survival would become much harder. I couldn't hide from reality forever. Leaving the woods was one of the hardest decisions I had made in a long time. That clearing had given me something no shelter, couch, or car ever had. Peace. But I knew I needed more than peace. I needed stability. I needed income. I needed a future. So, with a heavy heart, I packed up my small camp, said goodbye to the river, and made my way back to the city. The city hadn't changed. The streets were still crowded. People still rushed past each other, lost in their own worlds. But I had changed. The time I spent in the mountains had given me a new perspective. I wasn't returning as someone defeated. I was returning as someone determined. I threw myself back into work, taking any job I could find. I washed dishes in a diner, cleaned houses. I did landscaping work. None of these jobs were glamorous. They were physically exhausting and paid very little. But they kept me alive. They kept me moving. They reminded me that I still had value, even if my life didn't look the way I had imagined. I still didn't have a permanent place to live, but I had a routine, a sense of direction, a small piece of stability. One afternoon, after a long shift at the diner, I decided to treat myself to a cup of coffee at a nearby cafe. It wasn't much, just a small moment of comfort in an otherwise difficult day. I sat down, exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and took a deep breath. That's when I heard someone call my name. First, I thought I was imagining it. But when I looked up, I saw a familiar face, someone I hadn't seen in years. It was David, an old college friend. Seeing him felt surreal, like life had suddenly paused and rewound. We had been close in college, working together on volunteer projects, dreaming about changing the world. He looked just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. After a moment of awkward silence, he asked the simplest and hardest question. "How have you been?" I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain that your life has fallen apart? That you're homeless, exhausted, and barely surviving? But something in his eyes felt genuine. And before I knew it, the truth spilled out. That chance meeting in a cafe wasn't random. It was the turning point that would rewrite my entire future. As soon as I started talking, I couldn't stop. I told David everything, about the community art center, how it had been my dream, how losing it had shattered me. I told him about the funding cuts, the eviction, sleeping in my car, and the months of rejection. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told him how lost, tired, and hopeless I had felt. I expected him to react the way many others had, with polite sympathy, uncomfortable silence, or awkward encouragement that didn't lead anywhere. But David didn't do that. He listened, really listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He didn't look away. When I finished, he didn't pity me. He respected me. And then he did something I wasn't prepared for. He offered to help. At first, I resisted. I had spent so long trying to survive on my own, trying to prove that I didn't need anyone. Pride had become my armor and also my prison. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to feel like a charity case. But David was persistent. He told me he was doing well at his company and wanted to give back. He made it clear that his offer came from genuine care, not obligation or pity. He believed in me, and that belief felt foreign, uncomfortable, and deeply moving all at once. After some convincing, I finally agreed. David helped me secure a part-time job at the company where he worked, doing data entry. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't creative. It wasn't anything I had ever imagined myself doing, but it was steady. It paid enough to cover basic expenses. And for the first time in a long time, I had a sense of security. Walking into that office on my first day was intimidating. Everyone was dressed professionally. The environment felt structured, formal, and completely different from anything I had experienced before. I felt out of place, like I didn't belong there. But I worked hard. I showed up early. I stayed late. I double-checked everything. I wanted to prove that I deserved this opportunity. That I wasn't a mistake. That I was capable of more than my past circumstances suggested. David was there every step of the way. He encouraged me when I doubted myself. He reassured me when I felt overwhelmed. He never made me feel inferior or dependent. Instead, he treated me like an equal, like someone with potential, not a problem to be fixed. As the weeks passed, we began spending more time together outside of work. We grabbed coffee after shifts, reminisced about our college days, and talked about life, our struggles, dreams, and regrets. He was kind, patient, and thoughtful. And slowly, something inside me began to change. I stopped seeing myself as the person who failed. I started seeing myself as the person who survived. And without realizing it, I began to feel something more than gratitude toward David. I admired his kindness, his consistency, his belief in me when I had none. I looked forward to our conversations, our coffee breaks, and any moment we could spend together. What started as support slowly turned into connection. Then one evening, David invited me to dinner at his place. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to go, but because I was afraid of what that invitation might mean. I wasn't sure I was ready for something new. I was still rebuilding myself, still healing, still uncertain. But I said yes. That evening was simple but unforgettable. We cooked together, laughed about old memories, and shared stories from our lives that we had never spoken aloud before. There was no pressure, no expectations, just warmth, honesty, and comfort. After dinner, we sat on the couch talking long after the dishes were done. Eventually, the conversation faded into silence. Not an awkward silence, but a peaceful one. One filled with understanding, unspoken emotions, and something neither of us had to name. And then, without thinking, I leaned in and kissed him. That moment changed everything. From that night forward, David became my anchor. Not because he saved me, but because he stood beside me while I saved myself. He believed in my future before I could see it clearly. He reminded me of who I was beyond my struggles. And because of him, I began to believe in my dreams again, including one I thought I had lost forever. With love and stability slowly returning to my life, I took a risk that would lead me back to my true purpose, but this time in a completely new way. With David's encouragement, I began to think about art again, something I hadn't allowed myself to do since the community center closed. For a long time, art felt too painful to revisit. It reminded me of what I had lost, of the kids, of the dream that had failed. But David reminded me of something important. Art wasn't my failure, it was my foundation. So, slowly I began teaching private art lessons in the evenings. Just a few kids at first. Nothing fancy. Nothing official. But the moment I picked up a paintbrush and stood in front of a child again, something inside me clicked back into place. Felt alive. Useful. Whole. During the day I worked my office job. In the evenings I taught art. The combination gave me something I hadn't had in years. Balance. Stability and purpose. Survival and meaning. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just getting through the day. I was building a future. With steady income, I began saving. Slowly. Carefully. Every dollar mattered. Eventually, I had enough to rent a small studio apartment. It wasn't big. It wasn't fancy. But it was mine. The day I received the keys, I cried. That tiny apartment represented more than shelter. It represented independence, recovery, and proof that I wasn't broken beyond repair. I decorated it with what little I had, adding color wherever I could. The walls quickly filled with sketches, art supplies, and small reminders of the journey I had survived. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a place to heal. As I settled into this new chapter, I began thinking about the future. I couldn't stop thinking about the kids from my old community center. I wondered how they were doing, if they still had creative outlets, if anyone was helping them express themselves the way I once had. The idea of opening another community center felt impossible. I had already failed once. The risk felt too big, the memory too painful, but the desire to give back never left me. With David's support, I began exploring possibilities. Not another large center, but something smaller, more manageable, something I could sustain without relying on unstable funding. Eventually, I opened a small art studio in the community. It wasn't the same as the old center, but it was something. And something is better than nothing. I started teaching again, helping kids express themselves, encouraging creativity, creating safe spaces, even if they were smaller than before. It was challenging. There were obstacles. There were days I doubted myself. But I knew I was on the right path. One student in particular stayed with me. His name was Jacob. My old center, Jacob never spoke. He sat quietly in the corner, watching others. He never raised his hand, never asked for help. But one day he picked up a paintbrush and started painting. What he created was extraordinary. An abstract landscape full of emotion, depth, and beauty. I encouraged him to keep going. Over time he began to open up. He started talking, making friends, sharing his thoughts. Watching him transform felt like witnessing a flower bloom after years of silence. That experience stayed with me, and reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place. The kids at my new studio were different. Many came from more stable families. They didn't face the same struggles, but they still needed creative expression. They still needed encouragement. They still needed someone to believe in them. And I was grateful to be that person again. Through it all, David stood by my side. We both had our struggles, but together we found a way forward. Our relationship grew stronger, not because life became easy, but because we faced challenges together. Looking back, I realized something I never expected. Losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to let go of pride, to accept help, to open my heart, to grow. If I hadn't gone through homelessness, heartbreak, and failure, I never would have met David. I never would have rebuilt my life. I never would have found my true strength. And yet, the most important lesson was still ahead. Because the real miracle wasn't just rebuilding my life. It was understanding why losing everything was exactly what I needed. Looking back now, I no longer see my past as a series of failures. I see it as a journey of transformation. At the time, losing my community center felt like the end of everything I had worked for. Becoming homeless felt like proof that I had failed. As a professional, as a helper, and as a person. Sleeping in my car, surviving day to day, and relying on the kindness of others shattered my pride. But what I didn't realize then was that I wasn't being punished. I was being reshaped. Homelessness stripped away everything superficial and forced me to confront who I really was. Not the founder, not the teacher, not the helper. Just a human being. Vulnerable, imperfect, but still worthy of love, dignity, and second chances. The mountains taught me peace. Cafe taught me humility. David taught me trust. And rebuilding taught me resilience. For the first time in my life, I learned how to accept help without shame. I learned that needing others doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. I learned that failure doesn't define you. How you rise after failure does. I also learned that love can appear in the most unexpected moments. That chance meeting in the cafe wasn't random. It was life reminding me that even in our darkest seasons, light can still find us. David didn't rescue me. He walked beside me while I found my way back to myself. He believed in me when I had nothing to offer but honesty and effort. Together we built something real. Not just a relationship, but a life rooted in growth, understanding, and shared purpose. My new art studio isn't perfect. It's small, has limitations, but it has heart. And sometimes heart is all you need. Every day I watch kids walk into that space. Some shy, some confident, some unsure of themselves. I see parts of my younger self in them. I see the same fear, hope, curiosity, and potential. And I know that even if I only help one child find their voice, this journey was worth it. I think about Jacob often, the quiet boy who found his voice through paint. He reminds me that sometimes people don't need words to heal. They need space, patience, and someone who believes in them. I also think about the version of myself who sat on that curb with everything in a few bags, wondering how life had fallen apart so completely. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I would tell them this. You're not broken. You're becoming. Because that's what this journey was. Not destruction but transformation. Losing everything forced me to rebuild. Not just my career but my identity. It taught me that my worth isn't tied to success, stability, or status. My worth comes from my ability to grow, love, and keep going, even when life feels unbearable. Life doesn't always make sense when you're in the middle of the storm. Pain rarely feels purposeful while you're experiencing it. But sometimes the things that hurt the most are the things that shape us the most. Today I wake up in a home I built. I teach in a studio I created. I love someone who supports me. And I live with a sense of gratitude I never had before. Not because life is perfect, but because I understand now that imperfection is part of the process. Every setback carries a lesson. Every loss carries an opportunity. Every ending carries the seed of a new beginning. If you're reading this and you feel like your life is falling apart, I want you to know something. This is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of your transformation. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. And if you're wondering how your own breaking point might become your breakthrough, your next chapter could be closer than you think.